two remarks. So I've written a paper. It's a rework of a paper that I gave at the in November called Polanyi, Professionalism and the Ethical. And it's actually, this one, Madness as Metaphor, picks up on some themes that were relevant in that one, particularly the relationship of the ethical and the therapeutic. I owe a lot to Diane, who roped me into doing this for the AAR, and wrote the abstract from a conversation we had on the telephone, and it was such a brilliant abstract that I could only follow up on it by writing a paper which might not have been quite as erudite as the abstract, but came as close as I could. And a lot to Dale for posing this question about the extent to which post-critical thinking is therapeutic. And just to presage what the answer is in terms of madness as metaphor, and I will elaborate on this, it's therapeutic only insofar it's metaphorically therapeutic only insofar as madness is therapeutic, and mental illness, insanity in a medical sense is something quite different. And so philosophy can clear the decks for a certain kind of feeling better, a certain kind of well-being, but there's another kind of malaise that's very different. And I think some of those differences have occurred to me through the conversations that have happened here at the conference. And so I want to pick up more on the things that have happened during the conference since I wrote the paper, that if you read the paper you won't get, but maybe I'll get to incorporate in a little bit later. And then I want to particularly acknowledge Richard Gelwick, who can't be with us because he's facing the terminal stages of cancer apparently, and but was in Baltimore and has been with us for the last 40 years, and has inspired and clarified and helped us understand many important issues. Gelwick and I both go back to Polanyi pre-Poteet. As I said, the work with Charles McCoy at PSR and Doug Adams, who then as a student obviously was already a leader and a very inspiring person. And so Richard's contact with Polanyi from his time at Stanford, and McCoy's approach, which was very similar in some ways to Poteet's, in the sense that he was an interrogatory teacher. He asked questions which for me were very surprising. We had tutorials, as we did with Poteet, and we would write papers. I would write papers, I mean, it's one-on-one, and rather than say, he would assign things to read, and rather than say, what did this person say, he would say, why did you say this? And it's sort of like, oh, you want me to say why I chose these words. And so I went to Poteet with that, and so I think maybe my experience with Poteet was a little bit primed from the experience with Charles McCoy in that sense, which is a little bit different from what some people have described. But I would say, in terms of this question, several people have described Poteet as a Socratic teacher. I would say he was, in my experience, exactly the opposite from the Socratic teacher. As I understand Socrates, who interrogated his contemporaries to show them that they didn't know what they thought they knew, Poteet interrogated us to show us that we did know what we thought we knew, but were too shy or lacked the confidence or the validation or the self-accreditation in order to say it. Now, I think maybe some people had a more Socratic experience with Poteet, but in my understanding, I don't think of him as a Socratic teacher. I think of him as more post-critical in that sense. Richard, as David alluded to, hosted a conference, organized a conference at Harvard in 1992, at which he invited Robert Pirsig to speak. And Pirsig, one perspective on this, Pirsig came to the conference. Gelwick had invited him because he saw in Pirsig post-critical themes, and Pirsig came and learned about Polanyi, didn't pick this up out of Polanyi, but picked it up out of the experience of being a graduate student at the University of Chicago, as he says in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, driving him mad, literally, mad to the point that he was hospitalized, mad to the point that he had ECT. And even there, madness is kind of a metaphor. He really was depressed, he really got treatment, and he really got better, and he got insight, and he went on to write Lila, which is like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a story of an odyssey, a personal journey from which self-discovery occurs. In Lila, the character Lila, and Pirsig's character Phaedra sets this up, an anthropologist looking at cultures, and he helps us understand what it is to have a culture and to understand cultures. And Lila, in the course of this journey down the Hudson River on a sailboat, goes mad in quite a literal way. But we have a way of empathizing with Lila's madness that Pirsig has shared with us, because we can see that she inhabits a culture in which she is the only participant. There is no other belief system which you can make reference to other than her own world. So here's the kind of boundary between sanity and madness, that madness makes sense, as it often does for our patients if you understand the context of their life journey. But they can't participate in the outside world for one reason or another, and that becomes the therapist's job, even to the extent of using psychotropic medications or electroconvulsive therapy in the case of Pirsig. But hopefully can make a human contact as this is happening through the use of language and the shared space. Pirsig said something to me at one of the breaks, a meeting much like this, at an Ivy League school much like this, not far from here, with dining halls much like this. And he said, and this is not what I said in my paper, I think I said in my paper that Pirsig said society needs psychiatrists to help people deal with their problems, or something like that. What he said to me was, society needs psychiatrists to deal with people like me. And I thought that was a little bit personal and a little bit blunt to put in the paper, but also very candid and confessional. And I'm going to maybe make some other allusions as well to that. So in my paper here, I draw on, in both of these papers, Susan Sontag's metaphor about illness. She has a book called Illness as Metaphor, and she's talking about cancer. She also talks about HIV. She has another book called HIV as Metaphor, and she also talks about tuberculosis. And all of these illnesses, which we recognize in biological and psychosocial and even spiritual ways, have in common that when you get these diagnoses, it's something awesome and oppressive about them. And that awesomeness and oppressiveness about these diagnoses is that you're viewed differently by people around you. Now, she doesn't talk about madness, she doesn't talk about mental illness, but in the paper I try to extend her view, her metaphor of metaphors, to include madness, to include mental illness. And what literally Sontag is talking about is stigma, the stigma of cancer, the stigma of tuberculosis, the stigma of HIV/AIDS, and the stigma of madness, or the stigma of mental illness. What she says is that at some point in life, and most of us are at that point or past it, we trade in the passport of the well for the passport of the sick. And we begin to think of ourselves and understand ourselves in different ways. We understand the finiteness of life, we know we're going to die, and we know that that will probably include at some time some illness prior to death, some sickness onto death, some dread, some ontological reassessment of who we are. So the question is how to call that into attention in a way that Sontag did for herself and her readers. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, and that was what she's talking about in a personal sense. she lived with breast cancer for 30 years, or she lived 30 years after she was diagnosed with breast cancer before she finally died of breast cancer. So she had a good period of reflection, and fortunately some time that we could interact with her and she with us on that regard. Diane has raised the question about, does my metaphor of metaphors carry as much weight as I want it to do, and maybe she'll elaborate. I'm not sure if it does or it doesn't. Maybe we can have a little colloquy about that. But there's another aspect of it, that for me, in a very literal sense, in the work that I do in the Middle East, I have to carry two passports because of the way people in the Middle East, countries, nation states in the Middle East, get along and fail to get along with each other. If you go to the West Bank, you can't go to certain Arab states. If you go to Lebanon with an Israel visa in your passport, they look through every page very carefully because you could be a spy or you could have difficult allegiances. So the State Department gives people like me a second passport. So this is the passport I use when I go to Lebanon, and this is the passport I use when I go to Israel. But even within Israel, when I go into the West Bank, which I can do as an American citizen, I couldn't do if I were an Israeli citizen. So there are problems there. If I go into Syria, which I did in 2010, and I would be very unlikely to do now, there's actually an affidavit that says, have you ever been to the West Bank? If you say yes, you're denied your visa. If you say no, well, so two passports. Now, the reason this haunts me so much as it does in terms of the current issue about sickness and wellness, because you might say this is really madness to its extreme. But the issue, and I'm not sure if this gets at your concern, Diane, is that we think of passports in terms of nation states, in terms of countries with fixed boundaries. But Palestine is a country with very nebulous boundaries, West Bank, Gaza. Kurdistan is a country whose boundaries, which doesn't have boundaries. There's northern Iraq, but there's much of Kurdistan that's in Iran, Turkey, Syria, as well as Iraq. And so there's a situation where the boundaries don't coincide with the actual physical boundaries. And I think that's more analogous to the situation that we're dealing with. So in terms of modernity, let me just, by way of preface, throw out a couple of other questions which I will answer. The first night at Maury's, Gus asked a question which I think was really profound and profoundly important. And he asked me, who could be Bill Poteet's analyst when Bill Poteet is so clever and knows so much about the workings of the mind? And I want to come back to that question because therapy for Bill Poteet, it was a very important aspect of who he was, how he coped with some of the things that occurred to him in his life. And I think one of the things that we might say about Bill Poteet's therapy, and it didn't occur to me to say this until just a couple of hours ago, was that Bill Poteet's writings came after his therapy. That one might say, I might say right here today for the first time ever, that Bill Poteet found his own voice, even though he helped others so much to do that, in his own therapy. That his books all came after he retired and after he had therapy. So
just to be clear, Alan, are you saying he had therapy with a professional therapist?
Yes.
That he did his own?
Yes, yeah. And so that's in part the answer to Dale's question, is post-critical thinking therapeutic? And my answer is it's only therapeutic to the extent that madness is a metaphor, not to the extent that one is really dealing with real serious mental illness, I don't know how to say this. I mean, even the language that we have doesn't quite encompass what I'm trying to get at here. So what I will say about Bill, without saying too much about the conversations we had at the time that he was going through this, I think everyone knows, difficult period of his life, was that he did seek personal therapy, and it was helpful to him in a number of ways. The answer to Gus's question was, that Bill was by this time smart enough to realize that it wasn't a question of outsmarting the therapist and getting behind and defending against the things. He went into therapy in pain, and it was his own real embodied pain that he was dealing with, not with some abstract ideas about what pain might be and how you might engage in conversation about what you might be dealing with. Now, I think I like the fact that you brought up the turd. Because not only is it...
I didn't know how that turd would go over.
It went over big.
Hadn't thought about that.
And one of the things, and we can all think back to the period of toilet training, which we all remember so well, but have tried to forget, is that some things are very personal and very embarrassing, and that we don't often talk about. And so the task of therapy is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that can take quite some time. I mean, that's one of the reasons, say, Pink Floyd there, that you might spend 2 or 3 or 4 years in therapy before you get to the point where you could talk about your productions or other kinds of anxieties that just wouldn't be comfortable to talk about in the public space, even comfortable for yourself. And so it isn't like, I remember all of these things, and I'm not going to talk about them. That's what Freud called resistance. It's I don't even remember them until you become more comfortable with talking about things like turds. So that's the kind of shame that's a defense. Another of the things that came up in the course of the discussions was the question of memory and painful memories, and the fact that Polanyi talks so little about things which were obviously painful, or must have been painful memories as we think about what it would have been like for us to be in situations like that. And really the dissolution of European culture and all of the loss for Michael Polanyi personally and for his family, and yet never quite a space to talk about those things. And this is one of the things that's intrigued me and perplexed me in my work, because time is precious. We've just had the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, and each year in April, Rwandans go through a remembering ritual, which is at once painful and necessary. And the 20th anniversary has been, as big anniversaries are, sort of are really taking stock of this. And so one of the questions in Rwandan culture is that you shouldn't remember the past. And that may be part of the problem. It's disrespectful to remember the past. You should forget the past. And that plays out in Freudian psychotherapy, in any kind of psychotherapy really, and I think in post-critical philosophy, that how much do we remember and how much do we forget. And an interesting example of that occurred for me in this conference. And remember, I asked Bruce the first question, and Bruce said that he remembers me as a graduate student when he was teaching undergraduate courses, and I had a special dispensation to take his undergraduate course when I was a graduate student, which I'd forgotten, but he remembered me so vividly from that. 40 whatever years ago it was. And yet 3 years ago, he gave a talk at the National Museum, which I went to with my son, and I reminded him that I'd been a student of Bill Poteet and taken his course when I was a graduate student. He had no recollection of that on that occasion. Okay. It's a little bit embarrassing for me and my son, you know. You're this famous professor, and I studied with him, and he looked at me like, who are you? And now here at Yale Divinity School, he remembers me very well in this context, in this group. But he didn't remember that we'd just met at the National Museum 3 years ago. So memory is kind of a selective thing. And that's kind of the process that's so important, as you've articulated so well in terms of the narrative experience, to make these connections over and over again. And of course, in the process of therapy, it happens that many, many sessions are dealt with not remembering and not making those connections, and then every now and then, sort of like the tumblers in a loft, things do come together and something opens up. Okay, so psychoanalysis as reductive and psychoanalysis as a therapy, and then psychoanalysis as a theory of society. And you alluded to this, and I in my paper distinguish psychoanalysis as therapy from Freudianism as an abstract study. And this becomes interesting in Polanyi because Polanyi gives two examples of, in personal knowledge, gives two examples of the moral inversion. One is Soviet Marxism, which so occupied his thinking and his motivation, as you, David, so importantly elucidated why that was so important to him, and to all of us, in fact, in terms of something that had gone so horribly awry, and the dynamo objective coupling in which there was just no way of penetrating the kind of false logic that really led to massive destruction, human suffering. The other example he gives, and I had sort of appreciated this as I reread this for the Baltimore paper, was Freudian psychoanalysis as a specious form of moral inversion. And what Polanyi does there, he takes no issue with psychoanalysis as a treatment or Freudian theory as it might apply to psychotherapy. What he's talking about is really Freud's, as it turns out, later writings in which he speculates about the operation of psychoanalytic principles to society, which is speculative, which is subject to error, as is psychotherapeutic interpretation. I mean, this is part of the process that you never, a good analyst would never tell someone what's going on with them. They would raise the question. And the evidence in psychoanalysis would only be the associations that the person brings to bear. In many psychotherapies, we have to take shortcuts because we don't have time. But even there, Guillermo, we would say, I think what's going on might be this. Not to say, take it from me, I'm an expert. I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you. It just doesn't, there's no point in it. I mean, we might be right, but, what good does it do anyone if in the privacy of the session we're right and the patient is wrong?
And which is kind of interesting, with the cognitive behavioral kind of movement, which is this notion of trying to, deal with cognitive distortions, and that through some rational process of getting this person to understand they have this, they will somehow abandon this view and lived-in experience and interpretation of their life. And the interesting thing is that there's a group of students who never had the opportunity of have a psychodynamic, I won't say psychoanalytic, but at least psychodynamic, study, and learn basically mostly learning theory a la Skinner and then cognitive behavior therapy. And what the cognitive behavior therapists are now talking about is the importance that we need to teach them how to relate, how to establish a relationship, which is very interesting, in the sense that they have lost that dialogue process. That they thought if we can just get the person to rationally work through this.
So the real trick with cognitive behavioral therapy is that it be the patient's agenda or the client's agenda and not your agenda for them, which is always a temptation, an ethical temptation in the field. So thank you for that. So moral inversion. And this is the third question of the conference for me that I want to address here. I have a little section in my paper called "Religion as Moral Inversion?" ? And when you get to the point of saying a belief system which is impenetrable and which, from one point of view, you're coupled with your own forces in relationship to it. But there's no way of challenging the validity because there's also the objective way of looking at it, is very much like the predicament that I think modern theologians have faced through the 20th century. Many like Petit, Tillich in particular, the Niebers here, have struggled with this question of how do you make religious truth meaningful, and your paper did that so effectively, Jim, I think. But if and it might seem heretical for me to say this, But I think the question that at least needs to be raised, is religion a moral inversion? And then to parse that out, the next question would be, and I'll ask it before one of you asks it, so that I can give you my answer before before you get so Socratic on me and try to show me that I haven't thought about this as carefully as I might have, is that what do you mean by religion? And what I mean by religion here is particularly the kind of religion that Descartes experienced, whereby you could be put to death for heretical views. That's looking in the 17th century cockpit at those kinds of situations, which are not unlike, as Bruce Lawrence suggested, what went on in divinity school in the late 20th century, and what goes on in many of our institutions, that you perhaps aren't put to death for heresies, but you would be if we didn't have civil rights, or you might be. So there's that kind of tension and animosity there. What amused me about this was Dale picked right up on this in his review of the paper and said, "Oh, I don't think Petit said that." Petit was at great lengths to show the relevance of religion, spirituality, religious language, and so forth. And I think he was quite right, and I tried to suggest that in my paper as well. But what amused me and perplexed me about this question was I expected to stand in the shadow of Bill Petit in this, and would not Bill Petit at his best, maybe not in all of his aspects of his behavior, but would not Bill Petit in his best have hoped that we would have gone on into our own worlds and authored our own statements and made our own choices, which might be different from the positions that he took. My children went off to college and came back from college, and I began to notice that they had ideas that they hadn't heard in their own household. and met that with some pleasure and some skepticism perhaps, but the realization, perhaps helped by the fact that it was a developmental psychiatrist, that this is what's supposed to happen.
She'll get over it.
And I think, in my case at least, that I haven't spent my life in the academy, at least the religious academy. It's been medical schools and then the humanitarian world, which is another whole thing in itself. But that there is this sense in terms of how do we fit into this particular box, and that may be part of the issue about how do we get out of this box in terms of the implications that might be useful for other aspects of knowledge and for society. There's a whole section in the paper about the dreams of Descartes, where it shows was Descartes a Cartesian? No, he couldn't have been, because he was a human being. And what did that mean? And what was he dealing with? And what do his dreams tell us about his life? And what does his biography tell us about the challenges? But basically the idea that Descartes, in a way we might appreciate, successfully carved out a territory for doing rational thought that wasn't to be squashed by the ecclesiastical authorities. So to that, we might be very grateful, as much as that gratitude is ambivalent. The last point to make, perhaps, let's see here. I'll share with you some of Petit's memories. This is a little aside, but I think these are stories that are to be cherished. Because when my little boys that later went up and became men and had different ideas were little, Petit used to love to regale them up in the mountains with stories about his childhood in Shanghai. And one of them was when he came back to Georgia and his cousins drank water out of the sill faucet. And he'd been so conditioned that you weren't to drink the water, and he was so frightened when he saw his cousins doing this that he fainted.
Oh.
And you imagine, the precariousness of raising children in China in the early 20th century. Another that he told, and this is a real story about disembodiment, was that when they went out riding through the city gates, where the heads of the thieves had been arrayed to sort of deter people as to what the consequences of misbehavior were. His mother would put a blanket over his head so that he couldn't see what was going on. Obviously, he knew what was going on because he tells the story to my little boys, who hopefully were deterred by the possibility that misbehavior could really have very bad consequences for you. But one that he told was very charming and historically very interesting. Was that when the Japanese came, this would be 1939, and they were to leave just ahead of the Japanese and waiting for the train at the station, he had 10 silver dollars in his little box that he was taking as his treasures. And he took a piece of paper and put it over the dollars so if the Japanese came, they wouldn't see that he had 10 silver dollars and they would be safe. And then when the train did come to take them all away, there was so much excitement that he left in a hurry and left them behind. Now, this is all very charming, and in 1991, I took my first trip to Shanghai. Shanghai was a very different city then than it was when Bill was there. Now it's a very different city from what it was in 1991. But what in 1991 you'd see these wonderful 3-story buildings with courtyards, which would be the sort of place where Bill and his family would have lived in the 20s. And in the middle of the courtyards would be 15-story apartment blocks. And now you would see 50-story apartment blocks. These all would be torn down in most neighborhoods. And when I was there, most recently in 2011, 2009, maybe 2008, that Shanghai was building 6 Manhattans every 6 months. And it's just an amazing place. But what I remember from that 1991 trip was that we went into an old folks' home, and one of the people on in our group sat down at the piano and started playing Christian hymns, and the old folks started singing them in English. What a friend we have in Jesus. And I thought, it might have been Bill's mother that taught some of these people these hymns. So that was kind of a very charming recollection of that. Now, I already made the point about Bill as a Socratic teacher. One of the things to think about in terms of the box that we're in, it's very much a Western box. And if you go to the East, I remember in Bangalore, I was giving some lectures once, and one of the psychiatrists there said to me, sort of like took me aside and like, son, there's something I want to remind you of, which is that in the East, we never underwent the mind-body split. And so I think this kind of globalization, is like, who do we turn to who understands justice in a way that doesn't rely on Western categories of justice? And someone like Amartya Sen, who understands very well the predicament we have, but also can draw on a different kind of tradition in which we can understand spirituality in a very different kind of way.
I think that psychiatrist was wrong.
You think what?
I think that psychiatrist was wrong. Indian philosophy has a rich tradition of both of monism and dualism. And the dualists, there are spiritual monists, there are materialist monists, and there's, the Advaita philosophy, which is non-dualistic. And so, at least in the tradition of Indian philosophy, they certainly do have the mind-body split. They might call it matter and spirit, but at the same time, there are people who take very strong totally materialistic positions in Indian philosophical tradition.
So I think the thing, to say he's right or wrong is to say he understands his tradition in a way different from the way that you understand your tradition. And I think one of the things that you or I would notice if we went to India or if we went to Nepal is that spirituality is very much a part of the often weave of everyday life in a way that it often isn't here.
I've been in India. I know, I agree with that. But I think when we're talking about, the mind-body split and in the context of philosophy, it's a mistake to say, well, they don't have it, because they really do.
So again, that may be generalization, we're talking about 1 billion people, And, and I don't know that they would all adhere to the generalization that you're making there. But what your point is that there are different strains in Indian philosophy. Some of that has come from,
Let me just give an example of something that's very common. And it's not just a question of, the kind of the elite Indian thinkers, but is also something that's commonly talked about, and that is reincarnation. And so if you're holding a doctrine of reincarnation, in which the soul undergoes successive reincarnations at different times, it's very difficult for me to think about that without thinking about the soul as being a substance of some kind that is distinct from the body that it happens to be incarnated in at this moment. And reincarnation is a widely held belief.
and so that would get to the question of what is consciousness and what is suffering. And I think those things would be understood differently from most Indians than they would be from most of us. So let me just conclude by restating the conclusion that I made earlier, which was that post-critical thinking is therapeutic, and it clears the decks for an understanding of ourselves in relation to our predicaments, but it's only therapeutic in the sense that madness is a metaphor, and it's important to understand those metaphors as we understand who we are in relation to what troubles us. So with that, I'll open the floor to discussion and comment.